Hello and welcome back to the Educatedcollins Snap channel. How you doing? So today we're going to be talking about Electro Ramp. We're going to do a deck breakdown for this. I think it's a pretty common deck, pretty standard. It's one of the decks that you're likely to try as you are climbing in Series 3 and just has a lot of ways to utilize. It's a pretty common deck, pretty powerful deck, I think. So definitely want to talk about it. And just understanding this deck kind of bridges you into other ramp principles. It's just a nice deck to have knowledge of so that you can like maneuver around similar deck lists in a much easier fashion. So what is Electro Ramp essentially? The deck strategy is usually you play a ramp card. Usually it's Electro, but it can be other tools to summon powerful minions ahead of curve, and then you just put out consistently more value than the other players that have limited energy resources turn after turn. So after you play the Electro, you can play a 5 power card and a 6 power card and another 6 power card. It's sometimes hard to deal with that level of big play after big play after big play. That's the strategy. Here we have a standard list, pretty normal stuff in here, Electro plus Wave, and then you just summon, usually Doctor Doom is your biggest payoff, and then Odin like follow up into the Doctor Doom is just like very hard to deal with, but that's like the idea here. This is just a general list to take a look at. So now when we talk about core pieces, Electro Ramp, it's in the name. One of the core pieces. It just gives you that extra mana to ramp cleanly. So this just gives you an extra mana per turn. Just allows you to play a bigger card and a bigger card and a big card. Is just one of the key pieces to ramp. Next up, we do have Wave. This is an alternative ramp option. So it doesn't give you mana turn after turn, but it lets you cheat out mana for one turn and then you can follow up. So usually when you play Wave, you'll play Doctor Doom afterwards, and then you can get the payoff on turn 6 with an Odin or something like that. And speaking of Doctor Doom, I think Doctor Doom's a core piece because it's one of your biggest payoffs for playing Electro or Wave to get it out early and then combo it up with an Odin, which is another, I think, core piece where it just synergizes a lot of what you want to be doing. Synergizes with your ramp, synergizes with your Doom, synergizes with a lot of the other payoffs. This is just a really nice card to add in the deck. And then last but not least, we have Sandman / Leech. These cards just shut down counterplay against this deck. With Sandman, you can lock him to play one card like you are doing. With Leech, you can just nullify their battle cries or ongoings and things like that. So they just help remove some of the counterplays that people would like to do against this type of deck. So it's usually nice to have one. You could add both in a deck, but usually there's like one copy of this type of card in the deck there. Now let's talk about some of the tools, right? First, we have the early ramp tools. So these cards just let you get expensive cards out early in the game, and they just give you energy to play out your units. So that's Electro, that's Wave. And we also have Jubilee, right? So Jubilee is another way of getting these big cards early. Since you have a ton of big cards, the likelihood that Jubilee pulls something powerful is pretty high. So it's usually okay to add a Jubilee in this deck. Usually Jubilee's like game plan is to pull Infinite, but Infinite's not really in this deck because you're not going to be spending a turn doing nothing. Even though you do have the Sunspot, it's not that likely that you're going to do nothing on turn 5 or turn 4, essentially. So most of the time, you're just going to want to have other cards you can play normally, and Jubilee just helps you pull those out. Now, here are the ramping payoffs. So these are cards you want to be getting played after you play the ramp. So you want to just stack or just follow up the ramp with a ton of these type of cards, right? So here we've got Doctor Doom, Magneto, Devilsaur, Arrow, those type of cards, just big payoff after big payoff after big payoff. That's why the deck is strong, because you just get to play a ton of these powerful cards. Usually people only get to play one or maybe two in a game normally. So that's usually the strategy here. Now, how do you pilot this deck? This deck isn't that complicated, I would say, in terms of piloting it. You just want to play your early game and then you want to play a ramp card, right? So if you don't have a ramp card on the turn you play the ramp card, usually turn 3, you're probably behind. You probably want to think about how to either maneuver into like baiting their opponent to leave or just not risking extra cubes than you need to. So if you don't have those ramps, you got to be very careful. Now, you got to be aware of your Odin combos. This deck really relies heavily on your big payoffs and essentially how Odin works with those payoffs. So, one of the most common things is Dr. Doom into Odin. That's really one of your win conditions. If you can do that, you have a really good position. That's where you think about snapping. Arrow into Odin is also pretty good, even though Arrow got nerfed. With Sandman, you can just force people to play one card so that Arrow isn't as risk or bad or vulnerable as it normally is, since they're only playing one card. The Arrow can do a lot, so you can go Arrow and then you can like set him up to go back into it with the Odin again, right? Because they'll proc the Arrow again. Then Jubilee into the Odin is also very, very good, right? Because they'll proc the Jubilee again. You're summoning another big card, so that can be a really nice way of getting payoff there. So like something that happens a lot is you Jubilee, you hit Dr. Doom, and then turn 6 you'll go Odin into that Dr. Doom into that Jubilee, and you're just like, yeah, haha, you've lost. So there's definitely things you have to be aware of when you're playing this. Odin's a really big, powerful card to take advantage of. Now, if you can Sandman and Leech or Leech on turn 4 after Electro, that's really when you want to be doing good. Any other window is pretty much too late. If you want to play Sandman turn 5, is not really that good for you. Really, turn 4 is you want to do it, but you don't want to do it after Wave, right? So you might say, oh, you can go Wave into Sandman, but that's really not that great. It's okay, it's something, but you only do that if that's your only play or like your best play there. But you usually want to be playing Wave into Dr. Doom so that you can hit the Odin on it on turn 6. So that's usually the idea. If you're going to be playing Wave, you want to be playing something big to follow it up. You don't really want to be doing a Leech or a Sandman. Leech could be okay depending on the matchup, but it does depend. So yeah, we've talked about it already, but Dr. Doom Odin is a powerful 5 play into a 6 play, right? You'll get 10 power across every single lane. Plus, the lane you're playing the Odin on will get a little bit more power since it has higher base. And an Arrow can still be clean. So just keep in mind, like, oh, what are my combos for turn 5, turn 6? That's really what this deck is about, right? Doing these huge plays in the final turns with your, combos. So if you're playing this deck, you have to be thinking about those combos, right? How can I take advantage of this deck list? How can I use the Dr. Doom, the Odin, the Arrow, the Devil Sword if you're playing that? Now, a couple of things to remember is that Sunspot gives extra power with the Electro energy. You're usually going to have some energy left over with Sunspot, and that's particularly important with Wave. If you go like Wave into something after also playing the Electro and you have the Sunspot over, right? The turn you're playing Wave, Sunspot's going to get some energy. And then the turn afterwards, you're only going to spend 4 mana and you might have like 7 mana or 6 mana. So once again, Sunspot's going to get that energy. And that can be something that your opponent's not really paying attention to. It could be like a pseudo Sandman in that respect. So that is a way to use Wave later on in some matchups where you might be like, how do I use this? If you think of Wave as maybe like a 6 power card instead of a 3 power card because you're getting some power for your Sunspot, it might be a little bit more viable to justify playing it, where if you're only looking at it as a 3 power card, it doesn't really feel that good to waste your turn on that. And then another thing is opponents can calculate your total power, right? So this isn't the most sneaky deck, right? It's pretty telegraphed in what you're doing, right? If you're playing Dr. Doom, people will usually think Odin and things like that. So you have to make sure you're calculating your board state and how does it contest against other board states. Now, Dr. Doom and Odin is very strong, don't get me wrong, like that'll win you games, but if your opponent knows it's happening, they can manipulate their power to kind of beat that barely, and then you lose, right? So you just have to make sure you're calculating your total power. You can't really turn your brain off on this because it's telegraphed. You can kind of turn your brain off if your game plan's not telegraphed because they don't know what you're doing. But if your opponent knows what you're doing, then you have to just make sure you're doing the extra work to make sure you're not ignoring the obvious, like, oh, if they play something random here or something normal here, if they play a Dark Hawk here, do I lose, right? You have to just make sure you do the math. Now, here we have some of the powerful plays in this deck. It's not the only powerful play, but Jubilee can hit a ton of things, right? So Jubilee into anything big can really be a very powerful swing. It's just something you have to be aware of. Now, Electro into Doctor Doom into Odin, right? That's like your big combo. That's your main win condition in this deck. If you can get Doctor Doom to Odin somewhere, or you can get anything with double procs or so Kalimatar or something like that. Those can really do a lot for you. So just keep that in mind. That's really one of your biggest powers. You get 35 power off of 3 cards, which is pretty difficult to beat. So that's definitely something you can keep in mind. And then something else you can do is the Electro into Sandman into Doctor Doom. It's hard for them to contest all your lanes with the Sandman there, right? They can only play 1 card. So it makes it pretty easy to win 2+ lanes if you have that Doctor Doom follow up. And then if you follow it up like an Odin, now you're now you're getting a bit crazy, a little bit too strong there, right? You'll get 40 power. So that's some of the powerful plays you can do with this, right? It's the ramping into something or the Jubilee payoff. And there's still other combos in there too with Devil Dinosaur and Arrow and whatnot. But these are some of the plays you can be looking at. Now we have the flex slots. I have a ton of cards in here. It's not that this deck is like super flexible, but I think there's just a lot of pieces that can go into some of these spots. You don't really need a lot of the cards. The only thing that's really super core is the Electro and the Doctor Doom. Everything else is pretty flexible in whether you play with it or not. So it's just that there's a ton of cards that are not core in this deck. So anything you don't really want to play with, you can just change for other things. So here are just some of the lists, right? We have Iceman, Lizard, Ebony Moss, Psylocke. These are some of the early games that you can use. Armor is another one that we'll probably talk about, but there's a lot of early game you can play with, right? Iceman is really very annoying to deal with, so I definitely like playing Iceman, but with the Electro, the Sunspot can really start absorbing some free energy, so it's generally fine to play the Sunspot here. But you can also run other big things: She-Hulk, Black Panther, Zola, Claw, Spider-Woman. These cards are just very big. If you don't have maybe a Magneto, you could play something else in there, Giganto, even if you really wanted to do that. So it just really depends on what makes sense for you. Then you can also play Cosmo if you want to. I don't super recommend Cosmo, but if the meta does say Cosmo's really good, then right, just follow the meta and play it. But it doesn't really help you too much. I would say Cosmo hurts you because a lot of your cards are on reveal, so you kind of lose a lane where you can play something, and if they also play a Cosmo, that could really mess you up. So I don't super recommend Cosmo. It's not really something in there. Looks like I have She-Hulk twice, by the way, which it doesn't matter. Shang-Chi obviously can be put in almost every deck. It's just so common that people play something that's very powerful, and it hurts you too in terms of like it can hit your cards if they play a Shang-Chi. So just have to keep that in your mind. The nice thing about this deck is a lot of your biggest payouts don't get hit by Shang-Chi. So if you go Doctor Doom, Odin, none of those get hit by Shang-Chi. Arrow doesn't get hit by Shang-Chi. It's really the Magneto and the Devil Dinosaur that can really get messed up by that. But you don't always play those cards anyways, so Shang-Chi doesn't always hit you. And then Leech could hit you as well, right? If it hits your Odin, that could be pretty bad. Vision, Captain Marvel, those cards just move around. They're very flexible. So it's just nice to play those, and you can just pretend to put one in one lane and then really work towards a different lane intentionally. So that could be nice. It's usually better with Lockjaw, but you could play Lockjaw in here, but we haven't went there. And then White Tiger. White Tiger is really more for like Wong, White Tiger, Black Panther, Zola. If you want to do that kind of thing, you can add a White Tiger. It's a pretty powerful 5 in terms of how it plays, and it can do some things for you. So it's lower in the priority of optimized list because you'd rather just have Doctor Doom and Odin instead of like White Tiger is like a weaker Doctor Doom, so you don't really super focus on a White Tiger, but it is something you could play if you want to focus more on an on reveal list to really take advantage of that Odin proc at the end. And then Shuri can just work in everything. I think right now it's just really strong if you can play it. Red Skull as well, right? You could definitely play Red Skull if you don't want to play whatever Magneto. You could play Red Skull if you want to. So it's not bad to run a Shuri. I have a deck with Shuri and Electro. It works pretty fine generally. I don't really feel the weakness of it, so definitely think it's playable. And then these are like more archetype defining cards. If you play Lockjaw, your deck will change a little bit. If you play Galactus, your deck will change a lot. Galactus is something I want to make a breakdown for it itself, but it's still something you can just put Electro. But I'm probably going to dedicate a video to Galactus since it's such a unique archetype in itself that I don't think you want to just tack it on here like this. And then Nimrod can also work. Nimrod Galactus is really its own also archetype in there, but you can definitely play Electro into Nimrod, into Destroyer, into whatever you want. So that's definitely another way of playing that archetype. I just didn't put it in here, but it is something you can do. And then Quicksilver Domino, if you don't want to have those early game 1 drops, if you don't want to play Iceman, you don't want to play Sunspot, you can definitely run Quicksilver Domino. I would probably recommend Domino more than I'd recommend Quicksilver or both of them. I think Domino is definitely a lot easier to make work out for you. But usually if you're playing that, you're probably playing Lockjaw because you don't really need to have that guarantee too. Even though the 2 is nice, you don't have to guarantee it. But it is something you can do. It can work for sure, so I don't think it's a bad particular play, but it's just something to keep in mind. And now let's talk about core card alternatives. I would just say you only need Electro and Doctor Doom. Those are the ones where you really have to have those. I think Doctor Doom is like so important that I can't say you can ignore it or do something else. Maybe you could play like a White Tiger variant, but it's just not going to be the same. I honestly don't think it's the same. So really Electro, Doctor Doom. Everything else up in the air. You could just not play Wave. I would say Wave is good to just have that consistency, but if you just don't have a Wave, you're just early in the collection. Like you could definitely play the deck without Wave, but once you get the Wave, you'd add it back in. And then Magneto, Arrow are not like super important either, so you could definitely replace those for other big cards. You could go Black Panther, Zola, you could go She-Hulk, etc. There's a lot of big alternative options besides Magneto or Arrow, so they're not that important, I would say. It's just the Electro and the Doctor Doom you do need. Now, when should you snap? I think if you've got the Electro Ramp curve, right, so that's like Electro into a 5, into a Doctor Doom, into an Odin, that kind of stuff where you've got like perfect curve, and you have a 1 and a 2 or something like that, perfect, you've got a perfect curve, like usually you snap into that, but if you just see in your hand, like take advantage of it. And then anytime you want to trust Jubilee, right? So a lot of times when people are playing Jubilee, they play the Jubilee and then they see it's good, then they snap. If your deck is built around Jubilee being good, you should snap before you play a Jubilee. So this is just a common thing. If you're playing Jubilee, snap before Jubilee. Like that's just a common thing. And then Doctor Doom in a restrictive location. So if you can get that 5 power in a location that most people can't access to, it's definitely a good time to take advantage of it. You don't want to do it like before you're about to play you could do it before you're about to play the Doctor Doom, but you don't want to reveal it like, oh, I got Doctor Doom and then I'll play the snap. You want to be like, okay, Doctor Doom's my hand in 2 turns, or the turn I can play it, I'll definitely surprise them that I can reach this or something. Like because like when you play the Electro and you're telegraphing this ramp deck, they start thinking, oh, they have Doctor Doom, so you have to kind of catch them before they realize what deck you're playing. So that's definitely something you have to keep in mind. And then the Odin payoff, right? If you can get Doctor Doom into Odin or anything like that, Aaron to Odin, right, or whatever. There's a lot of Odin synergies that you can take advantage of, and if you just have a good Odin synergistic curve, well then it's definitely a good time to snap. Now, what are some of the weaknesses? Cosmo Goose. Cosmo shuts down your on reveals, and your deck is so many on reveals, so it's really bad for you. Goose, right? Goose, you can't play 4, 5, 6 cards. That's more than half of your deck, so it really messes with you. Iceman can also be super effective because if it hits your Electro, if it hits your wave, and that's your only ramp, it just delays your ramp, and it like shuts down how you want to position this deck. So Iceman could be really bad. You just have to be careful about that. Shang-Chi is not that bad for you, but I want to put in there just because it is something you can lose to if you play your Dino early and they Shang-Chi or something. That could also be pretty bad. And then the other weakness is that your plays are pretty telegraphed, in that if you're ramping, you're going to play a 5, or you're going to play a 6, or you're going to play a 6. Like, you better hope it's Doctor Doom into Odin or something like that. It's kind of telegraphed. So if your opponent knows exactly what you're going to play, that's always a bad thing. You don't want your opponent to always know what you're going to play, because it just makes it very easy to predict how much power you're going to have in every single lane, and they can play around it. So that's definitely a weakness of this deck. Once you're playing against people that are very familiar with the deck, very skilled, they'll know, oh, they're playing this deck. Well, then, there is that weakness there. So you just have to be careful about that problem. All right. Why isn't Leech in standard deck? Well, I just didn't want, I know how, I've seen YouTube now. A lot of people just watch the first 5 minutes. They skip around. They don't watch the whole thing. They'll just look at the standard deck list and they'll look at the example builds. They're not watching the whole thing. So I'm just doing the player base a service. The people that are not paying attention, they'll just look at the standard deck list. Oh, no, Leech. They won't put it in their list. And then we just don't have to deal with Leech. Well, the people that are paying attention, obviously, you'll see, hey, I mentioned Leech everywhere. But I just didn't want to have it on my conscience, so, you're welcome. Anyways, let's go into example builds. First one, we do have Leech in it. Sorry about that. It's a card that works. I'm not going to deny people that it's effective. It can be effective. This does have both Leech and Sandman in it, but it's a lot of these decks aren't very different from each other. You have a ramp, and then you play something on 5, and then you play something on 6, and then you win the game. You play another thing on 6, and you win the game. Like, it's not that difficult, not that different, I guess, against each other. This one is kind of cool here, where you actually have this Dr. Octopus into Heimdall alternative win condition, where you go Dr. Octopus on the right, and then you'll Heimdall. You'll move that Dr. Octopus in the middle lane, and the Heimdall, right, you'll probably play it on the left or the middle, depending on where you need the power. And you can definitely mess up your opponent. So this is another cool way of playing this ramp, where you get to go like maybe Dr. Octopus into Dr. Doom into Heimdall, right? And that could definitely win you the game right there. So it's just another cool way of playing Electro Ramp. If you like it, if you think it's interesting, try it out, see if it works for you. If it doesn't, well, move on. But yeah, I thought it was cool. Next up, we have Black Panther Wong variant, where you go Wong into Panther, and then you have the Spider-Woman, you have the Zola. You still got the Doctor Doom Odin, you still got the Sandman. So it's still very common or very normal, but it just has different win cons besides the Magneto and the Arrow, right? You could go Black Panther, Zola, Spider-Woman, that kind of thing. This is just a deck build if you don't have Magneto, because you could definitely run something like this. Next up, here we have the Ebony Maw. I don't know if any of the other decks have Ebony Maw. The first one did, but yeah, Ebony Maw is definitely a way of running this. I think it's a really strong one drop to play here, especially with the Doctor Doom, right? It means that you have a lot more reach on that lane. Even though the Ebony Maw is preventing you from playing that lane, the Dr. Doom will kind of give you that lane back. And you also have Claw as well as another way of reaching into that lane. So it's not hard to win the Ebony Maw lane, even though you're playing one card. It's actually not even that bad for you. So there's definitely another way you can play out the Electro way and just have a lot of more options. And then the Psylocke is another way of ramping, so it's very easy to ramp here. And next up, we have another Claw build here. Just a little bit more of the same, right? These are the same pieces, just mixed and matched, you know, to be how you want it to be. So it's not too complicated, right? The key thing is the Dr. Doom into Arrow and then have Electro and Wave. Like those are just very common, and everything else is just like mix and match. Do you want to play Sandman? Do you want to play Leech? It's not too complicated here. So that's kind of it. And then the last one, we do have another Wong Panther variant here. This one's definitely a little bit more unique, I would say, since it's running the Thor and the White Tiger, right? It's just like, do I just want to, you know, heavily index on the on reveal? Because Wong into Odin is really, really strong. So you just get the Wong set up into Tiger or Doom into Odin, and you just like fill your board with tons of power. So that's kind of what it goes. You also have the Iron Heart if you want to do that. So it's definitely a little bit more on reveal centric, but it's just something you could look at. If any of these interest you, feel free to utilize them and see how they work for you. So overall, that is the Electro Ramp. Definitely wanted to do another deck breakdown because I got asked on stream, when are you going to do one? And I was like, you know what? I'll do one. So I hope you guys like it. Take care of yourselves. I'll see you in the next one. Have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.
Educatedcollins snap. Once you watch him, you won't go back. He'll teach you tomorrow snap. Your skills will be